Now we're on Daf Chaf Amid Beis. Avol amanti omar shchita li of min yesh shchita li of min Torah yesh ikur. Rav Acha says that if the Torah requires shchita in oath, just as it does in behemos, then the psule shchita will apply to the shchita of an oath, including ikur, which is dislocated pipes, and that's psul is going to apply to ophos just as it applies to behemos, and the Gemara rejects it. Amalei, so they told Rav Acha, Adar Rabba Ipcha Mistaber, the logic is pum fakert. Why? Lamandi Yom Yesh Shchita Liof Min Torah. If the Torah requires Shchita Min Oaf, then the Torah is going to define what constitutes Shchita in Ophos, and the Torah drops the requirement and the psul of Ikur. Is Ikur Meimet the Chiagmere the Ein Ikur, right? All of the laws of Shechita will halach l'Moshe Sinai. Right? All the Torah says is one word, v'zavachta. And maybe in the halach l'Moshe Sinai of a doraisa of Shechitas ha'of, HaKadosh Baruch Hu transmitted to Moshe that there's no psul of ikur. V'afilu man diyomer v'behema. And even though we're establishing a parallel or an analogy between Shechita behema and Shechita in Oaf, but le'inyan ikur lo havi kebehema, although Shechita in Oaf should be the paradigm from which we derive the halachas of Shechita. Shechita behema should be the paradigm from which we derive the halachas of Shechita in Oaf. Nevertheless, halacha Moshe Sinai was that the psul of ikur does not apply to Oaf, and in that sense, we don't treat the Shechita of the Oaf like the Shechita of an animal. But Elaman the Orein Shchita Min Torah Ofos, meaning the whole institution is midivrei sofrim, then the Rabbanan would have to establish, we have a rule, an absolute rule of thumb that called the Tikkun Rabbanan came to Raisa Tikkun, they would have to fit their institution of Shchitas Ofos into the Doraisa of Shchita. And the Doraisa of Shchita is in Behema. Shchitas Of would have to be parallel and reflect all the requirements of Shchita of Behema. And just like in Shchita Behema, then Ikur is possible, so too in Shchita of Of. Elam Divrei Sof Mechik Mirale, Mi Behema is Kula Milsa Behema. Right? If the Rabbanan are deriving or extending Shchitas Behema to apply to Shchitas HaOf, and that was the rabbinic institution requiring Shchita in Ofos, then they would have to take along all the laws of Shchita in Behema, meaning the psul of Ikur would have to be carried over and applied to Shchitas HaOf. Amar Avina, Amali Ravin Bar Kisi, Haditani Rami Bar Yechezkel, Ein Ikur Siman Ba'ov. Lo Amaran El B'Malik Abel B'Shchita Yesh Ikur. All new pshat, in which Ravina, quoting Ravin, is going to make a fundamental distinction between Shchitas Ophos and Malikas Ophos. And since the archetype of Shchita is Behema, and in Behema there's a psul of Ikur, therefore the subcategory of Shchita of Ophos would likewise have the psul of Ikur. But when it comes to Kodshim, and now we're bringing this Oph, Lomazogan as a Karban Ola, well, guess what? Now it's an entirely new entity, and that's what the Brisa of Rabbi Yechezkel was all about. Within the context of this new entity of Malika in an Ola, in a Karban Ola, in Oph, here, the Torah says there's no psul of ikur. So the Gemara rejects it. V'amar Rab Yirmiyah Amar Shmuel Kol Kasher B'Shchita Kenegdo B'Oref Kasher B'Malika Ha How can you tell me this? When Shmuel made the equation between Shchita and Malika, and he established that anything that's valid for Shchita is valid for Malika, implying that anything that's invalid for Shchita is invalid for Malika, and the underlying principle of Shmuel is an exact equation between Shchita and Malika. Now you're telling me that in Shchita is a psul of Ikur. How can you possibly suggest that there's no psul of Ikur with regard to Malika? That can't be so. And the Gemara's answers are who pliga. Now, it was Rabbi Yirmiyah who brought this transmission in the name of Shmuel that posits and premises, if you could use that as a verb, that there's an equation between Shchita and Malika. However, Ravina tells us in the name of Ravin that we don't accept that interpretation of Shmuel that was transmitted by Rabbi Yirmiyah, and we don't accept that there's an absolute analogy between Shchita and Malika, and therefore we could say that in Malika there's no psul of Ikur, even though in Shchita there is a psul of Ikur. Omer Ze'iri. Okay, so now we're starting, I call it the sugya of Ze'iri. This is a back and forth in Ze'iri. Nishbara mafrekes v'rov basar ima nevela. Let's understand. If an animal is treif, what we call a treifa, then although the shechita of a treifa does not permit you to eat the basar, but it does remove tumah. Whereas if the animal drops dead without shechita, that's called nevela. And nevela is metame bebeis habliya. If somebody eats a kazayas of the basar nevela, then as he swallows it, he becomes tameh. And you can't shech the nevela, it's already dead. You can shech the treifa because it's still technically alive, and that shechita is meaningful to effectuate a tahara as opposed to tumas nevela. Comes along Ze'iri, and he says the following, that the animal at some point is considered already dead. It might be hopping around, but it's considered dead. And once it's considered dead, it's nevela, and it's metame, tumas nevela, bebeis habliya. So comes along Ze'iri, and he says that if the neck bone, which is called the mafrekes, is broken, so even though the neck bone is broken, the pieces of the broken neck are still hanging together, and the animal is not a treifa, and it could survive. But then he also removed rov basar ima. At that point, when it's both A plus B, nishbra mafrekas, and also rov basar ima, together with most of the basar, the flesh, then the animal is considered dead. No shechita will be meaningful, and it's nevela. And if it's nevela, it's metame betumas nevela. Rabbi Ze'iri teaches us that if the neck bone is broken along with most of the flesh upon it, then even if the animal continues to jerk, it is legally dead, and therefore it's metame tumas nevela. Omer Rav Chizda, afanan nami tnina. I have this in a Mishnah in Zvachim. And if that be the case, on the one hand, it supports Ze'iri, but on the other hand, why do I need Ze'iri if it's already in a Mishnah? Molak Besakin, okay, this is a Mishnah in Zvachim Daf Samach Ches. Now, this is very fascinating. Until now, we've been talking about Malika with his fingernail. Now we're talking about where he does malika with a sakin. Now I don't know. I mean, that's what this sugya is going to approach here. What's the status of malika with a sakin? A sakin is appropriate for shchita, not for malika. So again, we're talking about a carbon. We're talking about an olas ha'of, which requires malika, not shchita, and yet he took a knife and he shechted the simonim. Is mitami begodim bebeis habliya. Right? The Torah doesn't accept the shechita of an olas ha'of of kodshim, and therefore he's basically killing the bird. And if he kills the bird is an nevela, and it's mitame betumas nevela, bebeis habliya. So what do we see from this Mishnah? That shechita is not always meaningful to be mitar midei nevela. And if the shechita is not meaningful, then basically the animal died without shechita. And if the animal dies without shechita, it's an nevela and it's mitame begodim bebeis habliya. Iyam etreifa havya. And if you didn't accept ze'iri, and you would say that what? That as a result of the shechita, the animal is a treifa, is milikasa zui shchitasa taheni basakin litarmi de nevela. Right? Why don't we say that you're dealing with a treifa, and with regard to a treifa, the shechita is mitar midei nevela, and yet we're saying that this shechita is not mitar midei nevela because with the shechita, the animal is considered an avela. So how does this support Ze'iri? Apparently what happens is that with the shechita of an oaf, he cuts, right, what was Ziri's point? Nishbra mafrekes v'rov basar ima. So again, in this case of shechita, which is not a valid substitute for malika in olas ha'of, what's going to happen is that the shechita is shover the mafrekes, and if it's shover the mafrekes and rov basar ima, then you and I would have said that makes it into a treifa, and the shechita is mitar bidei nevela, midei tumas nevela, and the answer is that this price is teaching me no. It's teaching me exactly what Ze'iri said, that even though he was nishbra mafrekes v'rov basar ima, nevertheless, it's not an avela, and it's not mitame. I'm sorry, it's not a valid shchita, but it's not a treifa, I meant to say. I said nevela, I'm sorry. It's not a treifa, but rather it's nevela. So again, we have a Mishnah, or I'm not sure if it's a Mishnah or Brisa. Here it says, afananami tnina. I'm not sure. Tnina usually means a Mishnah, but here I think it might mean a Brisa. Anyway, Amri. So again, what's the chiddush of Ze'iri that we didn't know and we couldn't derive from this Brisa? Hasa mishum delav shchita hi kla. So let's emphasize the following, which maybe was implicit, but I don't think we said it explicitly. Ze'iri is not talking about an oath of kodshim that requires malika. He's talking about an oath in general, Chullin, that requires shchita. And he's telling us that although shchita could be meaningful in the case of a treifa, but in nishbara mafrekes v'ro basar ima, it's not a treifa, but rather it's considered dead, and it's an Avela, and it's Metame Tumas Nevela. However, the Mishnah or Brisa that we're learning now is talking about Kodshim. And therefore, this is not a proof to Ze'iri. Why? Because Ze'iri is talking about a case where there was Nishbra Mafrekas Urobas Ima, and then he did Shchita. And then the question is he doing Shchita of a treifa or no? And that's Ze'iri's Chiddush. You can't derive Ze'iri's Chiddush from this Brisa, because the Brisa is talking about Kodshim. And an Olas HaOf requires Malika. And he went ahead and he did Shchita. So again, even though basically he achieved exactly what he would have achieved through Malika by cutting through the Simon, but he did it with a knife, and that's not Malika. And if that's not Malika, then it's not called Shchita either. Because in Ofos, in Olas HaOf, the Torah requires Malika. So he doesn't have Shchita. And if he doesn't have Shchita, he can't be Mitar Midei Nevela. But that doesn't prove anything about Ze'iri, because Ze'iri is not talking about Kodshim, he's talking about Chullin. My time. Now the Gemara wants to know, this is a little bit of a digression, what's the underlying reason that justifies that Shchita cannot substitute for Malika? Rav Huna Amar Mipnei Shehu Machlid. Rava Amar Mipnei Shehu Dores. Now if the Torah is requiring Malika, then you can't tell me that Shchita is going to substitute for Malika, because Malika has Psule Shchita, and the very act of Malika could not possibly qualify as Shchita, and therefore the Torah must be saying that you require Malika, not Shchita. Just a machlokas between Rav Huna and Rava, which the Gemara is going to analyze now. What is exactly, if we can identify and pinpoint the Psul Shchita that applies to Malika? And here's where we have a controversy, diverse opinions here between Rav Huna and Rav. Rav Huna says no, the Psul is not Dores, but rather it's Machlid. Now, Rava says Dores, and these two, Machlid or Chalodim and Dores, are Psulei Shchita. What are they all about? So Machlid is kind of like Chafira, it's like digging something down. So what does he do? Instead of simply slicing the Simonim, the Shochet burrows down below the neck, and then he severs the Simonim. And Rava says that there's another psul called Doris. Doris means that he takes the knife and he pushes it down rather than slice it. Mandi Omer Neshu Machlid. If we're going to go according to Rav Huna, my time alo Omer Neshu Doris. I mean, after all, we said that Kotzetz v'yored. Do you remember that phrase? That Malika means Kotzetz v'yored. So with his fingernail, he pushes it down. So l'chora, Rav is absolutely correct. That's called Dores, right? In Shchita, that would be Dores. So how do we defend Rav Huna? Why does he reject Dores of Rava? Because Savar Molech Umevi Malika Kosher. That Kotzetz v'yored in Malika is not the only way to do Malika. You could do Malika by Molech Umevi, which exactly is the opposite of Dores. Uman Diomim Neshu Dores, but what about Rava? Why wasn't he willing to accept my time alone Mishu Machlid, right? That he's burrowing down below the neck of the animal. Amalei chalada hechidami bechulda hadara biikre batim de. So Rava gives now a mashal to explain what this burrowing is all about, the psul shchit of chulda, and that is when he burrows the knife underneath the neck bone, the knife is covered. You can't see it; it's not exposed. That, according to Rava, is the key of keys and the critical requirement of chalada in order to get the psul of chalada. But hacha here in this case, hamigalia. It's not concealed. It's not like the weasel that lives under the houses, but rather it's exposed. So Rav is of the opinion that chalada is only a psul when the knife is hidden from view. When one cuts from the back of the neck, although the neck does not part to the extent that it does when it's cutting from the front, nevertheless the knife can be seen. And such a shchita is kosher, and there's no chalada. So again, according to Ravi, you can't identify Malika with the psul of chalada because there's nothing that's concealed over here. You know, he uses his finger and he goes through the simonim. However, Rava does have a problem with Reb Zera. Ikashli akashli v'chimesa omed umole. According to Reb Zera, once you have broken the mafrekes, what's it called in English, the neck bone, and most of the flesh with it, then the animal's considered dead. So now when he does malika, he breaks the neck bone, and then he rips through, the simonim. The animal's already dead. So what, the Torah requires malika on a dead bird? Amalei Abai says, hey, and Rava, you think everything is smooth without Zeiri? Forget it. Tikshi l'cha sa'of to buy shnei simonim. Chimesa omed umolik. Right, the difference between olas ha'of and olas ha'chatos, or excuse me, chatos of, is that in chatos of you only have to do malik on one simon. But in the case of an olas ha'of, you have to do both simonim. That's called havdola, which I don't know if we're going to get to. Yeah, we'll get to here at the end of the dot. So therefore, once the Kohen does malik on one simon, immediately the bird is dead. And yet, he has to complete the malika by fingernailing the second simon on a dead bird. So Rava, your question of chimesa omed umolik is a kasha memela. Don't attack Zeir. Omalei, Rava says to Abaye, yesh l'chalik, we should differentiate. Hasam kidei l'kayim ba mitzvahs havdola. As far as malika is concerned, the malika was complete, even with the first simon. And in that sense, olas ha'of is like chatos ha'of. Why does he have to do malik on the second simon? That's because of a zaitik mitzvah, a mitzvah of havdolah, which is derived from the pasuk. But that I think we'll get to tomorrow. But in any event, he says the following: the mitzvah of malika requires making a clear separation between the head of the bird and its body. It's a little bit gory, but that's what the Torah requires. Havdalah. But I believe that's only an Olas Ha'of. Let me just make sure. Does he point? This requirement applies only to Olas Ha'of. So let me just understand this. When he does Malik on the first Simon, according to Zeiri, the animal is considered dead, and Rava says, how can you do Malika on a dead bird? So what does Gemara answer? The Gemara's answer is only for Olas Ha'of, because Olas Ha'of is a mitzvah of Havdalah. He says here in the note, Rava's difficulty with Zeir's teaching, right, of Omed, what was the language of Rava? V'chimesa Omed u'molik, remains in regard to Chatas Ha'of. You see, I would have said that in Chatas Ha'of it's not such a kasha because ah, just give me a second here. We have to end, but I just want to just think this out one more time here. Okay, I don't want to, we don't have time, but there's something here that's bothering me. Maybe I'll work it out before we get to tomorrow. Anyway, Abaye asks the following kashi, Hachi or Nami, right? If you're getting back to the Olas Ha'of, right, the halacha is that you have to sever the or, right, the skin, right? If one is obligated to do Avdullah in the case of Olas Ha'of, to sever the head from the body, he'll have to sever even the skin of the neck. A brisa below establishes that cutting the skin is not necessary. The brisa quotes Tanoim, who disagree as to whether one must cut through the entire thickness of both the kun and the veshit of a bird, an ola, or whether it suffices to cut through most of each, and all you need is rove of the two simon. But neither Tana, however, states that the skin must be cut. So again, nobody says that the skin has to be cut. And the question is, why not? I mean, you're telling me that you have to sever the head from the body, which is called Havdalah, and that's the mitzvah of Havdalah. So how could you leave some skin that would attach the head to the body? He should be required to sever the skin, which we know that no Tana holds like that. Rava answers, Kol ma'akiv b'shchita ma'akiv Havdalah, kol she'eno ma'akiv b'shchita, eno ma'akiv Havdalah. Right, for shchita, it's irrelevant whether you cut the skin, and therefore, as far as Havdalah, it's not required. Meaning, Rava sets up the standards of Havdalah based on what is ma'akiv, what's absolutely crucial for shchita. Abai says, I don't get it. V'hamiut simonim l'rabbanon, delo ma'akvi b'shchita, u'ma'akvi b'Havdalah. Right, the Rabbanon, remember we said there were two days, but according to one opinion, all you need is rove of the two simonim in a case of Olas Ha'ov, and yet there's no Havdalah here. So that in Shchita, Rov Shnayim is enough, and now you're telling me that if it's not Ma'akiv in Shchita, it's not Ma'akiv in Havdalah, so then why do we have to separate the two? Why isn't Rov Shnayim enough? That's enough for Shchita, it should be enough for Havdalah. Because your principle is a Ma'akiv Shchita, Ma'akiv Havdalah. So now Rava has to reformulate his statement. Kol yeshno b'shchita, yeshno b'avdol. Kol she'eno b'shchita, eno b'avdol. So since you don't have to cut the or, which was Abai's kasha, for shchita, therefore, as far as the mitzvah of Avdol is concerned, there's no requirement to cut the or. However, if you're talking about cutting, the simanim, well, you have to cut the simanim for shchita, and therefore you have to cut the simanim for havdalah. So again, I know we're going over time, and if you have to go, go. I just want to finish, just a few more minutes here on the top of Daf Chaf Aleph, Mikomakom Kasha. So we're still left with the Kasha of Rava, although, you know, we understand that you have to cut, both simonim, the connotation in the case of Olas HaOf, and you have to do it in its entirety, but that's for the mitzvah of Havdalah. But nevertheless, Reb Zeiri had already established that if you break the neck bone together with Rov Basar, then the animal is considered dead. So now Malika is being performed on a dead bird. This is what you have to do for Malika. Chotech shidro mafrekas below Rov Basar. That's going to be the answer to the problem that the objection Rava raised against the Iri, that the Malika is to cut the shidra. The shidra, we said, is the spinal cord. Umafrekes, the neck bone. But below Rov Basar, without the greater part of the flesh. And therefore the animal is still considered alive. It's not considered dead because the Iri only said that if he breaks the neck bone together with most of the flesh, that's when the animal is considered dead and it's nevela. But if he cuts the neck bone without severing most of the flesh upon it, the animal is considered alive, it's not dead, and therefore it is not a nevela. So he gives a summary here of the procedure for Malika, and with this we'll end. He says the Kohen pushes his fingernail through the back of the bird's neck, being careful not to sever the greater part of the flesh there. Then he continues to press until one pipe, or in the case of the Ola, two pipes, because he has Havdalah, is mostly or completely severed. That's going to be Machlokes. And only then does he cut the greater part of the flesh at the back of the neck. So the bird is still alive, and he's not doing Malika on a dead bird. So what we got up to for tomorrow is Ki Solik Rabbi Zeir. Okay then? So I wish you a great day. Thank you so much.